it is the quintessential union debate in that it has a tangible impact on people's lives. It's about things that weren't just relevant at the time, but continue to be relevant today. So in a way, it kind of lives on forever. Hi, I'm Neha, and I'm the Equalities Officer at the Cambridge Union Society.
Hi, I'm Darold, was PhD candidate in history.
Debate: James Baldwin versus William Buckley. Subject: has the American dream been achieved at the expense of the American Negro? This debate was held recently at the Cambridge Union, Cambridge University, England.
Unless we can manage to establish some kind of dialogue between those people whom I pretend have paid for the American dream and those other people
who have not yet achieved it, we will be in terrible trouble.
We are part of the American Vicarious Company, and we are bringing back to the debate hall here in Cambridge a reimagining of the 1965 debate between James Baldwin and William F. Buckley.
And I hate to say it here.
I'm Tegal F. Bouget, and I'm bringing James Baldwin back to the Cambridge Union.
And I'm Eric T. Miller. I'm bringing William F. Buckley back.
It's an honor to be in this space, bringing this back to the Cambridge Union, and hard to believe. We began working on this piece back in 2020, and here we are 3 years later, right at its origins. It's an honor, and it's quite humbling.
Yeah, someone asked the other day what we wanted them to take from this piece, and I thought Tegal answered it very well. He said, I can't tell you that. All we can do is present the words and present the arguments, and the connections that you make, the prevalence of it today, those kinds of discoveries are what we're hoping people will take from it. But all we can do is present the case that was given and let the audiences decide who they agree with.
It comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover that the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper killing off the Indians when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace and to which you owe your life and your identity, has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you.
I think what's really kind of powerful about that line is that Baldwin kind of juxtaposes that with humor right before it. He's able to talk about a really serious thing, but juxtapose that with humor and also make it relatable for his audience of students that might not necessarily be able to have that kind of same experience or know what it feels like.
Yes, I think that's what made Baldwin so impactful. He was such a great writer and orator, and he knew how to sort of communicate with his audience. But it did make me think, I remember when I first heard that, about what type of country, did we as Black Americans live in, that this was still going on.
It's also something that makes you think about the United States today, and it kind of forces you to think about, is that something that still goes on? And what kind of happens now? Has the country come to accept African Americans as part of its system of realities, as Baldwin puts it? Or are African Americans still kind of left outside that system of realities and not really accounted for by the systems and the structures that exist in the legal kind of sphere, but in the political sphere and stuff like that?
Yeah, and it brings you to what I study now. I study the independent Black towns and communities that sort of ran away from the craziness of America to try to create their own spaces. And even as a Black American in 2023 who, again, has lived a great life, I'm not sure that the American narrative accepts us. We create our own spaces, and those of us who have been, privileged enough to do so. But I think of the systems and institutions that trap so many people, so many Black Americans. Sometimes I think even more than during Baldwin's time. And this infrastructure of just violent white supremacy, of the narrative, like he mentions with the movies in Hollywood, but also in real, actual life. Nothing really has changed.
And I think that's really interesting because what you were saying about independent Black communities is that at the point at which the country that you know hasn't created space for you within its system of realities, the question then kind of becomes, do you then kind of take yourself out and create your own system of realities that accounts for you and your own narratives that account for you, right? Because it is really important to insert yourself within that, like create space within the system of realities that doesn't have space for you. But if at the point at which that kind of becomes unsuccessful, do we then kind of expect marginalized groups to kind of create their own system of realities, right? And like stand independent to the state, because I think that's what a lot of thinkers at the time would also advocate for, is the idea that you then need your own community independence from a state that kind of has at its heart not your best interests as a person.
I am stating very seriously, and this is not an overstatement, that I picked the cotton, and I carried it to market, and I built the railroads under someone else's whip for nothing. For nothing. The Southern oligarchy, which has until today so much power in Washington, and therefore some power in the world, was created by my labor and my sweat, and the violation of my women and the murder of my children.
I knew that speech. I knew some of the lines from it. I was familiar with it. I wasn't sure where it came from. And then when Christopher reached out to me and said, do we have any interest in doing this? And then I watched the debate, and it was so infuriating that I thought I can... The challenge of getting into Buckley was very enticing from an acting standpoint, but also the idea of getting these words in front of people in today's culture. I just realized that it was going to be effective. I realized that people needed to hear it, that people needed to realize that this happened, and that, you know, that Buckley went on to shape American policy and system. He was a trusted advisor of Reagan for 8 years. I mean, he shaped American policy.
It is impossible, in my judgment, to deal with the indictment of Mr. Baldwin unless one is prepared to deal with him as a white man. Unless one is prepared to say to him, the fact that your skin is black is utterly irrelevant to the arguments that you raise. The fact that you sit here, as is your rhetorical device, and lay the entire weight of the Negro ordeal on your own shoulders is irrelevant to the argument that we are here to discuss. The gravamen of Mr. Baldwin's charges against America are not so much that our civilization has failed him and his people, that our ideals are insufficient, but that we have no ideals, that our ideals rather are some sort of a superficial coating which we come up with at any given moment in order to justify whatever commercial and noxious experiment we are engaged in.
Here I'm struck by the fact that Buckley's forced to live in the theoretical after Baldwin has created a foundation of fact. And I find that still so much of what, quote unquote, what white America does. It reminds me of what, there was another interview that Baldwin did with, on the Andy Cabot show, where there was a white, and he was Jewish, the white Jewish professor really sort of made that, you know, so I'm a Jewish guy, but I have more in common with you than with, he was just questioning Baldwin on why he kept talking about race so much. And Baldwin's answer was like, you want me to sit here and accept these ideals in this country that I have never seen. And I see that so much that whenever, particularly Black Americans, bring facts about the lived experience and the reality, white America wants to go back into the dream, into the ideals, into, you know, this sense of sort of justifying what is happening, because somewhere down the road, or there's this idea we're all trying to get to someday, somehow, 400, 500 years later. And I'm struck by what Buckley is saying and doing at this moment is exactly what systemically, institutional, structurally, and infrastructurally that America still does to this day with this narrative.
Yeah, and I think what was really interesting is kind of at the start of his speech, he tries to pin it on Baldwin, that Baldwin is somehow the one being emotional and talking about feelings rather than the historical facts, right? He says the fact that Baldwin is bearing the weight of his ancestors and their experiences is irrelevant to his argument. And he's saying that his race is irrelevant to his argument, and trying to say that he's the one being emotional, when throughout his speech, Baldwin kind of talked about the lived realities, and like he talked about things that were written in the history books and things that did happen. But Buckley at the moment is trying to say that he has kind of misconstrued those in an emotional way to kind of undermine his arguments, when I think the fact that Baldwin is a black man is so important to the points he is making. It's not as irrelevant to his argument as Buckley wants to say it is, right? Because he's talking about the lived experiences of black Americans at the time and what they kind of had to go through. And that does factor into the American dream. And so I think that kind of response, again, kind of rings true to what we hear today in response to kind of when people point out the structural injustices in America today.
Buckley tries to deflect or gaslight Baldwin into believing that he's more emotional, but it comes through that Buckley has such a need to, one thing, maintain his whiteness, right, by creating or indulging the theory of the American dream, which was constructed by people coming from Europe who, let's be honest, couldn't make it there, and constructing a system of terror, of extermination and genocide. And before we get to the racialization of enslavement and the Jim Crow and black codes that Baldwin is historically speaking to, that to this day bear so much present weight, that someone who calls themselves white in the US can't contend with that on its own merits, right? Because you just can't contend with the, not only history, but the physical fact, and on top of the emotional and the intellectual, and you mentioned the material cost, that is still being sort of wrought to this day. Whiteness itself, and was it Baldwin who said that white Americans are trapped in a history that they just don't understand? And I sometimes think that, or I do think that this is what what Buckley is reacting to. For him to understand what Baldwin is saying will render him speechless. He won't be able to make a speech. So he has to go into the theoretical of gaslighting and claiming something that is just not true. This dream, this ideals, the fact that he says that Baldwin's the one that's bearing the weight of his ancestors, when it's him himself who has a need to defend the whiteness that causes the terror that has structured everything that Baldwin has just said.
Yeah, and I think, again, it's so relevant to today, right? In terms of the idea that Buckley's talking about, why is Baldwin bringing race into this? When it's like, that's the whole point, right? That the American dream is racialized. And that's what the entire debate is about, is kind of about the racialization of the American dream, and the fact that people are locked out of the American dream is what kind of the entire motion was about.
Let me just say finally, ladies and gentlemen, this. There is no instant cure for the race problem in America.
Anyone who tells you that there is a charlatan, and ultimately a boring man. He's boring precisely because he speaks in the kinds of abstractions that do not relate to the human experience.
Right now, there's such separation in America, maybe in the world, in terms of points of view. If you don't agree with me, I don't want to listen to you. I'm being canceled. What debate has allowed, and we've both really enjoyed the talkbacks, it's allowed people to hear two opposite sides, uninterrupted, both extremely articulate, speak without interruption, and then the audience after, they speak without interruption. And we don't get that much anymore.
They voted in favor of the motion being that the American dream is at the expense of the Negro. They voted in favor of that motion 544 persons and against 164 persons. The motion is therefore carried by 380 votes. I declare the House to stand adjourned.
The reason this means a lot to the union today is because this debate was a way in which two people who disagreed were able to have a conversation about something that was important to them, and kind of dissect that. And that proves why we're still relevant today and why the Union is still important today, because just like we did in 1965, what we do now is we allow a space for people to discuss controversial issues and debate things that are relevant and that people talk about today.